Most people believe inflation is something you notice. Higher grocery bills, more expensive rent, gas prices that feel wrong but somehow familiar. That belief is comforting because it suggests inflation is visible, measurable, and therefore manageable. But the most destructive inflation does not announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly. It moves slowly at first, and by the time it becomes obvious, the damage is already irreversible. Here is the uncomfortable truth most Americans have never been taught to see. What you experienced between 2021 and 2023 was not the inflation crisis. It was the preview, a psychological warm-up, a soft introduction designed to normalize something far larger. And that larger event is already in motion. Right now, as you listen to this, the United States is locked into a mathematical process that has only one historical ending. Not recession, not recovery, not reform. Currency destruction through inflation. This is not an opinion. It is arithmetic. And once you understand the arithmetic, you begin to see why no election, no policy shift, and no Federal Reserve press conference can stop what's coming. Let's begin with something simple. In January 2020, before COVID, the total money supply in the United States, measured by M2, stood at roughly $15.4 trillion. By December 2024, it had reached $21.2 trillion. That means $5.8 trillion was created in less than 5 years. To understand the scale of that number, consider this. In 1980, the entire US money supply was $1.6 trillion. In 5 years, we created more than 3.5 times the entire money supply of the early 1980s. Quietly, digitally, without public debate. And here's the first psychological trick. Most people assume that once money is printed, inflation happens immediately. That assumption is wrong. Money does not move through the economy all at once. It moves in waves. The first wave never hits consumers. It hits assets, stocks, real estate, financial markets. That's why stock prices surged more than 60% after 2020. That's why housing prices jumped nearly 50%. That wasn't prosperity. That was monetary expansion, expressing itself when new money always goes first. The second wave is what people call inflation. Groceries, rent, energy, insurance. That's what Americans felt between 2021 and 2023. And that pain was real. But it still wasn't the main event. Because the third wave, the one that destroys the middle class, always comes last. And it hasn't fully arrived yet. Why? Because the $5.8 trillion already printed was never the real problem. It was the trigger. The real problem is what comes next. The United States currently carries more than $36 trillion in national debt. That debt is not theoretical. It demands interest payments. In fiscal year 2024 alone, interest on the debt exceeded $1.1 trillion. That is more than the entire US defense budget. Interest is now one of the largest line items in the federal budget. And here is the trap. Debt creates interest. Interest creates deficits. Deficits create more debt. This loop cannot be escaped through growth. It cannot be escaped through taxation. It cannot be escaped through spending cuts. The math does not allow it. To stabilize the debt without inflation, The US would need either massive spending cuts that would dismantle Social Security and Medicare, or tax increases so large they would crush the economy politically and socially. Neither will happen, which leaves only one path: money creation, debt monetization, inflation. This is not a policy choice. It is a default setting. Every government in history that reached this point made the same choice, not because they were evil, but because inflation is the only option that delays political consequences, and delay is always preferred. This brings us to a crucial realization. The inflation that destroys societies is never sold as destruction. It is sold as relief, emergency measures, temporary stimulus, necessary support. Each round justified by the crisis before it, and each round slightly larger than the last, until inflation becomes structural. At that point, wages stop keeping up permanently. Savings lose purchasing power year after year, and people feel poorer even as the numbers in their accounts rise. This is the most dangerous form of economic deception. Nominal wealth increases, real wealth collapses, and most people never learn the difference. History shows this pattern repeating with disturbing consistency. Ancient Rome followed it. Germany followed it in the 1920s. The United States entered it in 1971, when the dollar was detached from gold. Every time, the result was the same. The middle class was annihilated. Not overnight, but gradually. So gradually that many never realized what was happening until it was too late. In Rome, the silver content of the denarius was reduced again and again to fund imperial expenses. The coin looked the same. It spent the same, but it contained less value. Prices rose. Savings evaporated. Landowners and elites survived. Wage earners did not. In Weimar Germany, money printing accelerated to pay unpayable obligations. Workers were paid twice a day. Families spent wages immediately before prices doubled again. Those who held real assets survived. Those who trusted savings were erased. In the United States, the process has been slower and therefore more deceptive. When the gold window closed in 1971, the dollar became pure fiat. Unlimited in theory, politically constrained, but not materially constrained. Over decades, deficits grew. Debt expanded, and inflation quietly transferred wealth upward. The top 1% steadily increased their share of national wealth, not through conspiracy, through proximity to assets. This is the key insight most Americans never hear. Inflation is not evenly distributed. It is a wealth transfer mechanism. Those closest to money creation benefit first. Those living on wages and savings pay last, and pay the most. Which brings us to the present moment. The $5.8 trillion already printed has not finished moving through the system. But even more important than that is what the debt mathematically requires going forward. Over the next 15 years, servicing existing debt will require tens of trillions in additional money creation. Not because policymakers want it, because there is no alternative. This is the $90 trillion problem. Not printed all at once, printed gradually, relentlessly, disguised as stability and devastating in its cumulative effect. The question is no longer whether inflation will continue. The question is, Who understands the pattern early enough to adjust? Because when this phase fully asserts itself, there will be two Americas. Those whose wealth structure absorbs inflation, and those whose wealth structure is destroyed by. In the next part, we will break down the exact four-stage pattern every currency collapse has followed for 2,000 years, and show precisely where the United States sits in that cycle today. Not to provoke fear, but to restore clarity. Because clarity, at this stage, is survival. Every currency collapse in history follows the same architecture. The names change, the technologies evolve, the justifications sound modern, but the structure never does. This is the mistake most Americans make when thinking about inflation. They imagine it as a one-time spike, a policy error that can be corrected with discipline and resolve. History shows something far more uncomfortable. Inflation is not an event, it is a process. And once that process passes a certain threshold, it becomes self-sustaining. To understand where the United States is today, we need to examine the four stages that have defined every major currency debasement over the last 2 millennia. Not metaphorically, mechanically. Stage 1 is denial through confidence. This is the phase where money creation begins quietly, justified by necessity. Wars, crises, recessions, emergencies. In Rome, it was military expansion. In post-World War I Germany, reparations. In the United States, it was financial crises, pandemics, and systemic bailouts. During this phase, inflation remains low, or appears manageable. Why? Because newly created money does not flow into everyday consumption. It flows into institutions, banks, markets, assets. This is why asset prices rise faster than wages. Stocks inflate. Real estate inflates. Inequality widens. But consumer prices remain relatively calm. The public is reassured. Experts declare the system stable. Critics are dismissed as alarmists. This phase can last years, even decades. In the United States, it lasted roughly from 1980 to 2020. Debt expanded, deficits normalized, money creation accelerated, yet inflation appeared subdued. This created a dangerous illusion, the illusion that the system was different this time. Stage 2 is normalization through inflation. This is the phase most Americans believe is the crisis. Prices rise noticeably. Cost of living increases. Wages fall behind. But institutions still function. Markets remain open. Employment continues. Life goes on. This phase feels uncomfortable, but survivable. People adjust behavior. They reduce discretionary spending. They take on more debt. They accept lower standards of living. Crucially, policymakers frame this phase as temporary. Supply chain disruptions. Transitory inflation. Unique circumstances. In the United States, this phase emerged between 2021 and 2023. Inflation surged to levels not seen in 40 years, but it was still treated as an anomaly, not a structural shift. This framing is essential, because once inflation is accepted as structural, confidence erodes, and confidence is the currency of fiat systems. Stage 3 is acceleration through debt. This is where history becomes unforgiving. As inflation rises, interest rates must rise to maintain credibility. But higher rates increase debt servicing costs. Those costs expand deficits. Expanded deficits demand more borrowing, and more borrowing demands more money creation. This is the debt spiral. At this stage, governments face an impossible choice: raise rates enough to stop inflation and bankrupt the system, or suppress rates and allow inflation to accelerate. Every historical example shows the same decision. Rates are eventually suppressed. Inflation wins. This is not cowardice. It is survival logic. Because allowing systemic collapse is politically impossible. The United States is entering this phase now. Interest payments exceeding $1 trillion annually are not sustainable. Every rate hike makes the problem worse. Every attempt at fiscal restraint collapses under political pressure. This is why inflation will not be defeated. It will be managed, and management always favors debtors over savers. Stage 4 is confidence erosion. This is the final stage, and it does not require hyperinflation. It requires something far subtler: loss of trust. People stop thinking in terms of long-term value. They stop saving. They stop planning decades ahead. They accelerate consumption. Money becomes something to exchange quickly, not to hold. At this point, inflation feeds itself psychologically. Velocity increases. The currency weakens. Foreign holders reassess exposure. This phase unfolds differently in reserve currencies. The dollar enjoys unique privileges. Global trade is denominated in it. Debt is priced in it. Demand for it remains structurally high. This delays stage 4, but does not prevent it. History shows that reserve status slows collapse, but deepens it, because imbalances grow larger before adjustment occurs. Now let's place the United States precisely within this framework. Stage 1, complete. Stage 2, experienced. Stage 3, unfolding. Stage 4, beginning psychologically, not yet visibly. This matters, because the most dangerous moment is not when inflation is highest. It is when the public still believes stability will return naturally. That belief delays adaptation, and delay is costly. Now let's address the number that anchors this entire discussion: $90 trillion. This is not a single bill Congress will pass. It is the projected expansion of debt, deficits, and unfunded obligations over the coming decades. Social Security, Medicare, interest, defense, entitlements. These obligations are locked in politically and demographically. They cannot be cut without social rupture. They cannot be funded through growth. They can only be funded through monetary expansion. This is the hidden inflation. Not tomorrow, over time. Slow enough to feel manageable, fast enough to be devastating. This is why traditional advice fails. Save more, work harder, invest conservatively. These strategies assume currency stability. They assume purchasing power holds. They assume time is neutral. In an inflationary regime, time is the enemy. Cash decays, fixed incomes erode, debt becomes attractive. This is the inversion that shocks people. The behaviors that once built stability now destroy it. and the behaviors once considered reckless become rational. This is not moral judgment, it is arithmetic. The middle class suffers most in this environment because its wealth is structured incorrectly for inflation. Savings accounts, pensions, fixed wages, long-term bonds. These instruments are designed for stability, not debasement. The wealthy, by contrast, hold assets, real estate, businesses, equities, scarce resources. Assets reprice with inflation. Debt shrinks in real terms. This is why inequality explodes during inflationary periods, not because of conspiracy, because of structure. This is also why inflation is politically tempting. It hides redistribution. No vote is required. No announcement is made. The transfer happens quietly, year after year. The tragedy is not that inflation occurs. It is that most people do not understand it until adaptation is no longer possible. In the next part, we will break down exactly how inflation reshapes society at the personal level, how behavior changes, how social contracts erode, and how individuals who recognize the pattern early protect themselves without panic. Because this is not about fear, it is about preparation. Inflation does not only reshape economies, it reshapes people. This is the part almost never discussed, because it cannot be measured cleanly on a chart. Yet it is the most destructive phase of all. When a currency enters a long inflationary cycle, society does not break immediately. It adapts. And that adaptation slowly erodes the behaviors that once held the system together. The first thing inflation destroys is trust in time. In a stable currency system, time is neutral. You can save today and spend tomorrow. You can plan decades ahead. You can delay gratification and be rewarded for it. Inflation reverses that logic. Tomorrow becomes more expensive than today. Saving feels irrational. Patience is punished. This changes behavior at every level of society. Households stop thinking long-term. Businesses shorten planning horizons. Governments abandon discipline entirely. Why sacrifice today if tomorrow guarantees less? This psychological shift is subtle at first. People don't articulate it. They feel it. They buy sooner. They borrow more. They hold less cash than feels comfortable. Velocity increases, not because people are reckless, but because holding money feels unsafe. This is how inflation accelerates without any new policy decisions. Confidence decays internally before it collapses externally. The second thing inflation destroys is honesty in pricing. In stable systems, prices convey information. They signal scarcity. They guide allocation. They coordinate effort. In inflationary systems, prices become noise. They change too frequently. They lose meaning. They stop guiding rational decisions. Producers raise prices preemptively. Consumers buy defensively. Contracts shorten or disappear. Economic relationships become transactional rather than cooperative. Trust thins. This is not theoretical. In the 1970s United States, long-term contracts collapsed across industries. In Weimar Germany, price lists were rewritten daily. In late-stage Rome, taxes were paid in kind because currency values shifted too fast. Inflation forces society to retreat from abstraction back into immediacy. The third casualty is the social contract. The middle class is the stabilizing force in any society. It works, saves, plans, and complies because it believes effort translates into security. Inflation breaks that belief. When wages lag permanently behind costs, effort feels pointless. When savings lose value, discipline feels foolish. Resentment grows, not toward inflation itself, but toward institutions. Trust in government erodes. Trust in expertise erodes. Trust in fairness erodes. This is why inflation precedes political polarization everywhere it appears. Not because people become extreme, because they become desperate for explanation. And desperation makes simple narratives attractive. This is the stage where societies fracture psychologically before they fracture economically. The United States is not immune to this process. In fact, its strength makes it vulnerable. Americans are deeply conditioned to believe in progress. That belief carried the country through wars, depressions, and technological revolutions. But inflation attacks belief itself. It suggests that progress can move backward quietly, that hard work can result in stagnation, that loyalty to the system can be punished. When this realization spreads, behavior changes fast. People seek protection rather than contribution. They optimize individually rather than collectively. This is rational, but corrosive. Now let's talk about the middle class specifically. The American middle class is uniquely exposed to inflation because of how its wealth is structured. Most middle-class wealth is not in businesses or productive assets. It is in home equity, retirement accounts, cash savings, fixed income instruments, wages tied to slow negotiation cycles. These instruments perform well in stable monetary environments. They perform disastrously in inflationary ones. Home prices may rise, but taxes, insurance, and maintenance rise faster. Retirement accounts inflate nominally, but purchasing power erodes. Cash loses value directly. Wages lag structurally behind prices. This creates a sense of running in place. People work harder, they earn more dollars, and yet life feels tighter. This is not accidental. It is structural. The wealthy experience inflation differently because their assets reprice dynamically. Businesses raise prices. Real assets inflate. Debt erodes. Inflation punishes creditors and rewards debtors. The middle class is often both, but predominantly a creditor in real terms. This is why inflation is often described as the cruelest tax. It targets behavior, not income. It penalizes thrift. It punishes caution. It erodes responsibility. And it does so without legislation. Now here is the most uncomfortable truth. Once a society enters this phase, reversal becomes extraordinarily difficult. Not because inflation cannot be slowed, but because restoring trust is harder than restoring price stability. Even if inflation moderates, behavior does not fully revert. People remember. They remember lost purchasing power. They remember broken expectations. They remember being told it was temporary. This memory alters risk perception permanently. This is why countries that endure prolonged inflation never fully return to previous norms. something intangible is lost. This is the cost the United States is approaching. Not hyperinflation, but normalization of erosion. Now, this does not mean collapse is inevitable. History does not end in ruins every time. But outcomes diverge sharply based on awareness. Those who recognize the pattern early adapt quietly. They restructure assets. They renegotiate debt. They prioritize flexibility over appearance. Those who trust stability will return naturally are crushed slowly, not dramatically, gradually. This is why education matters more than prediction. You do not need to know exact inflation numbers. You need to understand direction. You need to understand incentives. And you need to understand that governments do not defeat inflation. They manage its political impact. Which group you fall into depends on whether you interpret inflation as an anomaly or as a regime. If it is an anomaly, you wait. If it is a regime, you adapt. The United States is transitioning into an inflationary regime, not explosively, structurally. In the final part, we will tie everything together. We will explain why this process cannot be stopped without a crisis larger than inflation itself, what intelligent adaptation actually looks like, and how individuals preserve agency without fear or extremism. Because the goal is not survival at all costs, it is coherence. At this stage, a difficult question must be faced honestly. If inflation is structural, not accidental, why does no one in power say so clearly? The answer is neither sinister nor complicated. Because acknowledging structural inflation forces choices that no modern democracy is willing to make. Choices that would end careers. Choices that would fracture coalitions. Choices that would reveal how constrained the system truly is. So instead, governments manage perception, not by lying outright, but by narrowing the frame. Inflation becomes cooling. Deficits become investments. Debt becomes manageable over time. Each statement contains partial truth. Together, they conceal the whole. This is not new. Every society that entered a long inflationary cycle discovered the same political reality. Honesty accelerates instability. Ambiguity delays it. And delay is always chosen. This is why inflation is rarely stopped intentionally. It is interrupted only by crisis. Either a debt crisis so severe it forces restructuring, or a political rupture so profound it resets expectations. Neither outcome is gentle. Which brings us to the central paradox. Inflation persists not because leaders are unaware of its damage, but because the alternative appears worse. To stop inflation decisively would require allowing interest rates to rise until debt defaults cascade, cutting spending so deeply that social programs collapse, accepting unemployment on a scale unseen in generations. This would produce immediate pain. Inflation produces gradual pain. Gradual pain is politically survivable. Immediate pain is not. So inflation becomes policy by default. Not named, not voted on, but lived. This is the environment Americans are entering now. Not a crisis moment, a condition. And conditions reshape behavior. The most important adaptation is not financial, it is psychological. Understanding that the rules have changed. that the post-war assumption of stable purchasing power no longer applies, that time no longer works in your favor automatically. This does not mean panic. It means orientation. The people who fare best in inflationary regimes are not speculators. They are not extremists. They are not nihilists. They are realists. They understand three principles. First, nominal growth is meaningless without real growth. Seeing account balances rise is irrelevant if purchasing power falls faster. This shifts focus from numbers to function. What does this asset actually do? Does it produce? Does it adjust? Does it protect purchasing power? Second, debt changes character under inflation. In stable systems, debt is risk. In inflationary systems, fixed-rate debt becomes leverage. This is uncomfortable for people raised on financial conservatism, but history is unambiguous. Those who understood this early preserved wealth. Those who avoided debt at all costs often lost it through erosion. Third, flexibility beats prediction. Trying to time inflation precisely is futile. Understanding direction is enough. Those who maintained adaptability in skills, assets, and expectations endured. Those who clung to fixed structures suffered. This is not advice. It is observation. Now consider the broader implication. Inflation does not destroy societies instantly. It hollows them. It weakens trust. It thins cooperation. It rewards opportunism. If left unmanaged psychologically, it degrades civic culture. This is why inflation is not merely an economic phenomenon, it is a social one. And this is why understanding it matters beyond personal finance. A society that understands inflation can endure it. A society that denies it fractures under it. The United States stands at this crossroads, not uniquely, but consequentially. The dollar's global role delays consequences, but amplifies stakes. When adjustment comes, it will be larger because imbalances are larger. This does not mean catastrophe is imminent. It means responsibility has shifted from institutions to individuals. Institutions will manage optics. Individuals must manage reality. This does not require withdrawal from society. It requires discernment, knowing which promises depend on stability that no longer exists, knowing which narratives assume conditions that have expired, knowing when patience is virtue and when it is exposure. If you have followed this analysis to its conclusion, it is likely because something felt inconsistent between official reassurance and lived experience. That instinct was correct. Inflation is not something that happens and ends. It is something that unfolds, quietly, gradually, and then suddenly, in retrospect. The goal of understanding is not fear. It is agency. Agency to make decisions with open eyes. Agency to resist false comfort. Agency to align behavior with reality rather than rhetoric. If this perspective helped clarify the structure beneath the headlines, not emotionally, but intellectually, then engaging with it thoughtfully helps sustain work of this kind. A measured subscription supports depth over noise. A simple expression of approval signals that clarity still matters. And if there is one person in your life with whom you discuss ideas rather than argue positions, sharing this may open a conversation worth having. If you choose to leave a comment, let it reflect thought rather than reaction. A question, a counterpoint, a refinement. Those are the responses that move understanding forward. Thank you for staying to the end.